I would like to welcome Dr. Philip Payne, who's gonna give us our talk today about the Learning Health Record System. Thank you, Philip, for being here with us today.
Great, thank you, Daniel. I'm really happy to be here and see a few familiar faces, actually from throughout the globe. I will say at the outset, I would have been even more excited to have given this talk in person, so maybe in the future there'll be a chance to do so. I actually was having a conversation today with some colleagues about the fact that one of the things I think I missed the most during the pandemic is the opportunity to work with all my friends and colleagues and partners throughout the globe. So looking forward to getting back to that, but nonetheless, very pleased to be here with you all via Zoom today. And as Daniel said, I'm gonna talk about a topic that's really sort of near and dear to my heart, which is how do we sort of move beyond theory into the practice of building a learning health system. And I'm actually going to use a little bit of a sort of tongue-in-cheek play on that label and talk about the learning health record system. And I think it'll become pretty apparent in the talk in short order why I'm using that particular phrasing. So I think many of us, because of the area that we work in, are familiar with this concept of a learning health or healthcare system. Lots has been written in not only the scientific literature, but also in various policy frameworks and in the lay press around this idea that we need to do a better job of instrumenting the care delivery environment and capturing all of the relevant data that may be produced when we interact with patients and populations, and then use that information to improve the quality, safety, costs, and outcomes of the care that we deliver to those individuals. And while I will not sort of belabor all the varying definitions, the one thing I would like to emphasize is that from my perspective, the learning healthcare or learning health system is much more of a behavior than it is a sort of physical thing. Lots of people think about spaces and technologies, but I'm going to talk about this learning health or healthcare system as being a set of behaviors that we need to exhibit. And, you know, there are a number of ways of looking at how we might really inform or really sort of organize those behaviors. I'm particularly fond of this diagram from a paper that's written by a group, including my colleague Chuck Friedman from the University of Michigan, that talks about sort of the role of informatics in creating reusable knowledge objects as a function of all that data I just alluded to earlier. And the idea here is that sort of you have this virtuous cycle that begins with collecting that relevant data, assembling it, really going through the data engineering life cycle, producing knowledge as a result of various analytical methods, representing that knowledge in a way that is actionable, and then bringing it back to the right stakeholders at the right time, place, and in the right format. And usually this is organized around a problem of interest. It could be, how do we improve the quality or safety of care? How do we reduce costs? How do we deliver more precise therapies? There's a variety of themes here. But I think one of the important aspects of this particular diagram is it really represents what I think is central to these behaviors, which is that they are virtuous and iterative, right? It's not a unidirectional relationship, but really a cyclical relationship of all of these interrelated activities. So the real question then becomes, how do we build that learning health or healthcare system? And at a surface level, it seems relatively straightforward, right? We start by instrumenting the care delivery and laboratory and really everyday environments so that we can get all of that data that I alluded to before, whether that be at a biomolecular scale, a clinical level, or perhaps behavioral or broader environmental measures, such as those that we commonly refer to as sort of the exposome. If we get that data sort of in the format that renders it fit for analysis, we still need to make sure that people can access it. And that's where a lot of the conversation around rendering data as, you know, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable becomes very important, or the FAIR principles. And then we need to, once we analyze that data, often leverage technology to close the evidence cycle. Back to that diagram I just showed you before, to take that new knowledge that we've discovered and bring it back into the point of care or population levels. And then I think most critically, continuously measure and evaluate and improve at a systems level. And really building this learning health system is a system science problem, again, based around those behaviors that I had mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, as exciting as that may sound, there are a lot of challenges to doing what I just sort of broadly defined. And I'm going to cite a few reports over the last couple of years that I think that emphasize some of these challenges. One is a report that I'm quite fond of, mainly because of the clever title, which is Death by 1,000 Clicks. This is actually a lay press article that's based upon a study that was sponsored by the Kaiser Family Foundation. And it really focused on this issue around the usability of electronic health records, right? So electronic health records are ubiquitous and they're available at the point of care to help us to capture and manage data resulting from patient care activities, but there are huge usability problems, right? And the sort of premise of this article is that these usability problems preclude the effective use of the electronic health record because the UX is so perhaps fatally flawed. At least that would be the argument from this particular study. We also know that there's often challenges aggregating or integrating data across various platforms, right? Some people refer to this as information blocking. And the simplest way of thinking of this is that many of our sort of vendor partners that build electronic health records or other health information systems tend to think of them much like the AOL or CompuServes, if you'll forgive the sort of North American metaphor of the internet, where everything was in a walled garden and you don't need to go outside to the broader internet because everything you need is inside that walled garden. And in many ways, that's the behavior of many EHR providers, right? You don't need to look beyond the EHR, just keep all the data here within whatever your favorite system is, and everything will be fine. And that often manifests in sort of technical or other barriers to integrating data across those systems. We also know that there's a tremendous dialogue around the use of artificial intelligence to interpret all of this data, and that's very much a mixed bag, right? On one end of the spectrum, you have sort of endeavors like those undertaken by IBM to create IBM Watson using really machine learning methodologies to learn from large corpora of patient data and then inform clinical decision support. And we happen to know that that has not always been successful, right? A decision support tool that is trained on data from a large cancer center in an urban environment that's largely a tertiary care center, those sort of rules and sort of the underlying sort of probability structures don't map well to, say, a community cancer center based in Florida. And so, at least in the context of IBM Watson, we've seen a lot of, very visible instances where the system has not been seen as being successful, despite the power of the computational infrastructure behind it. But on the other end of the spectrum, you have studies like this one that was reported in the New York Times, where Google built an agent that could interpret chest CTs and actually found that it outperformed human radiologists in finding a variety of sort of primary and incidental sort of pathologies in these lung images. Now, it would be an entirely different talk to get into the details, but there are profound differences in the AI task between sort of broad cancer reasoning, such as what IBM undertook with Watson, and a very specific tailored task of interpreting imaging from chest CT, and that may explain in part the variable outcomes. And then, there's also this ongoing conversation around, well, what happens when we think beyond the clinic or hospital? What happens when people have devices in their pocket or sensors in the sort of living environment that are producing large amounts of data that's very relevant to people's health status and outcomes? And I think we could just all broadly agree, again, it could be a whole nother talk, that we don't really know how to integrate and use this data in conjunction with data from the EHR and other sources. And therefore, it represents both a huge opportunity, but also a huge barrier to getting that holistic view of what's happening to our patients. So all in all, I hope what you would take away from this is lots of promise, but lots of complexity. If I was more direct, I'd say that's probably job security for people like us in this seminar today, because it speaks to sort of the broad range of critical research and innovation questions that we all need to sort of focus our efforts on. Which then goes to, well, how should we undertake those efforts? If there are sort of these many, many challenges, how might we contextualize our approach to these sort of system science problems? Now, this is my only piece of homework I'm going to give you all during this talk, but if you have not read this book by Donald Stokes, Pastor's Quadrant, I would highly recommend you do so. It was actually recommended to me by a very senior informatician early in my career, and I'm very thankful that I read it when I did. But what Pastor's Quadrant speaks to is actually the sort of paradigm shifting way in which Louis Pasteur approached his groundbreaking science, which was basically not to think of basic and applied research as dichotomous and sort of imagining a linear relationship between them where basic science is sort of translated into practice and never the two shall meet again, but rather this idea of thinking about use-inspired basic research, which is really what we might think of as sort of an agile approach today, where we rapidly iterate between sort of the development and validation of novel theories and methods and their application in the real world. And the very same people that are building those basic methods are also working on this sort of applied science agenda. And I would argue that if we're going to build and operate a learning health system, we really need to focus our efforts, particularly in informatics and data science and digital health, on this concept of use-inspired basic research. I don't believe that a sort of unidirectional sort of pathway from basic research to applied research will get us to where we need to go. And I'm going to show you some examples in the remainder of this talk where I think I will hopefully sell you on this idea that use-inspired basic research is the direction that we need to move towards in this learning health system. And I've already sort of spoke about this, but talking about use-inspired basic research is a bit of a sort of heretical statement because it flies in the face of over a century of sort of conventional thinking around how we organize science, as evidenced by seminal reports like Vannevar Bush's Science: The Endless Frontier that really sort of laid out this sort of dichotomous relationship between basic and applied science, which, by the way, at least in the United States, has informed how we organize our universities, how we fund science, how we think about science policy, all comes down to this dichotomous view of research. And so I am going to say for this group that I think one of the important dialogues that we have to have around building learning health or healthcare systems is, do we need a renewed emphasis on use-inspired basic research? It has worked in the past, right? I think we've all benefited if you've interacted with the healthcare system from the work of Louis Pasteur, which is clearly an example of use-inspired basic research and stands in stark contrast to sort of what Bush and others argue about this dichotomous relationship between basic and applied science. So with that sort of preamble, sort of a theoretical grounding for the conversation, sort of what is a learning health or healthcare system, and what are some of the challenges to implementing it, and how we think about the scientific agenda required to do so, I now want to shift and talk a little bit more about sort of what I think of as the living laboratory for creating this learning health system. And I've already sort of given away the punchline by virtue of the title of this talk, but I'm going to argue that the electronic health record is in fact that living laboratory for building the learning health system. So why is that? Well, first and foremost, EHRs, unlike other sources of data, are real-time, they're patient-centered, and they can be used to capture and organize data from almost all aspects of healthcare delivery, and they can be used, if configured properly, to engage patients beyond the clinic and hospital. They include data, again, if used properly, beyond just medical history and procedures and diagnoses. They also include potentially patient-reported data or other sort of more qualitative impressions of global health status that may be captured through narrative text, not to mention features from images and increasingly biomolecular phenotyping through sequencing and other analogous technologies. It's also the case that EHRs allow for us to use things like decision support that inform sort of evidence-based practice and sort of evidence-based decision-making. And the process of using decision support actually creates data in and of itself in terms of the number of times providers do or do not agree with those recommendations, how they implement them, when, where, why, and how. And they can also be used to streamline workflow in a way that allows for us to sort of focus on what's important at the point of care or from a research standpoint and maybe de-emphasize those things that are not. So in total, there's a lot of desirable features that would make us believe that the EHR is that living laboratory for building the learning health system. And I've already talked about this, right? It is really at a foundational level something that is proximal to all these sources of data. It allows for us to customize and collect and manage that data. It can scale almost infinitely, again, if used properly. And ignoring some of the policy and business drivers, also has the real potential for interoperability and data sharing, as we see today with the proliferation of standards that allow for both the development of apps that can interoperate with the electronic health record, as well as increased health information exchange. And so all of these things really represent the building blocks we need to deeply phenotype patients and populations, and then both develop and apply sort of digital health interventions that improve quality, safety, outcomes, and cost of care. Again, sort of our ideal endpoints for a learning health system. Now, you may be all sitting here and saying, Philip, that's great. What you described sounds fantastic, but we all know that's not true because it's really hard to work with electronic health records. And, perhaps you might be thinking I'm a bit Pollyannish to believe that we can do this. And there's lots of reasons to be cynical. Certainly, the four I've listed here are more commonly discussed in sort of the broad health and life sciences community, and they include concerns that I already talked about before around workflow and human factors, making the data unreliable or incomplete in the EHR. They may involve concerns around data privacy and confidentiality, and therefore it may be too difficult to get that data even if it's been captured. Maybe people have had experiences where they say, the vendors just make it too difficult to both get the data out and to sort of design and deliver these digital health interventions. Or maybe perhaps, and apologies if there's any of our IT sort of operational colleagues on this call, but some people might say, well, IT organizations don't want to work with researchers and it's too hard to build bridges between the two communities, and therefore you can't do this because the IT people run the EHR and the informaticians and data scientists do their research, and it's really hard to sort of meet in the middle. And I think the question is, how much of this is fact and how much of this is myth? And how do we overcome some of these challenges if they do in fact exist? So you're quickly going to get the idea that I actually don't believe that these are real and substantive challenges, and that we do have ways to overcome them. And I'm going to attempt to convince all of you that that is the case. So I'm going to start with what I am going to label as myth number one, which is that workflow and human factors issues cannot be adequately addressed, so we can't trust the data that's in the EHR. And I think we have lots of conversations about this in our community. Well, the reality is we actually have a really good informatics toolbox for optimizing workflow and human factors in electronic health records. And I've named here, and I won't sort of belabor all of them, a variety of both theoretical and practical constructs for evaluating the usability of electronic health records and analogous systems, identifying potential problem areas, and then designing interventional strategies to overcome those UX issues. And I'm going to drill down on one in particular, which is time and motion studies. It's actually one of the oldest methods that we use in our informatics toolbox, and still very applicable today to improving workflow and human factors, and therefore the data that is in the EHR. So, as I said, time and motion studies have been around literally since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, and they originated as a way of understanding, how different variations in workflow impact efficiency or outcomes or costs. The most simple version, and I won't go into all the details, is really a continuous observation time and motion study where you literally track people performing a task and you time them and you see sort of what kind of interruptions or tools or other sort of dimensions of the workflow impact outcomes. And you do that repetitively, and then you analyze how those variations impact sort of the desired state of the workflow. And I'm going to talk more about continuous observation TMS, or time motion studies. I will say, if you want to learn more about sort of time and motion studies writ large in a shameless self-promotional plug, I'll point out that there's this review article that was developed by one of my students, Marcelo Lopetegui, who has worked in both the academic and industry sectors in informatics, largely in Chile. Danielle knows him well, and he has done a tremendous amount of work, which I'm going to cite here as a function of our collaborations in this space. And one of those projects was actually development of a tool meant to make time and motion studies in the healthcare environment more tractable and scalable. It's a tool called TimeCat. It's available freely today for researchers throughout the globe, and allows for multi-observer time and motion studies across multiple sites and environments. It allows for us to create formal ontologies or taxonomies that define all the tasks and dimensions of those workflows, allows us to assess inter-observer reliability, and produce real-time analytics. So this is a tool that you could download and use today to conduct large-scale time and motion studies in clinical environments, and we do that right now in our institution at WashU with our partners at BJC Healthcare. And actually, if you look at the bottom of that map, we actually have a global user community with several hundred users of this tool who use it for a number of use cases. By the way, one of my brief tangents I'll point out is not all the users are working in healthcare. We have professional sports teams and a variety of other sort of orthogonal sort of sectors using this same tool. But you can see on the right side sort of a screenshot of it running on a tablet where you set up your taxonomy events and record them. Here you can see sort of a visual alignment of multiple sort of workflows that have been recorded by observers in a particular environment. And actually then you can see real-time metrics, including inter-observer reliability assessments that allow you to understand, can I compare the results of my time and motion studies across multiple observers observers looking at either the same task or a set of tasks across multiple sites. So takeaways, this is something that's usable today. It's used throughout the globe, allows for us to conduct high quality, rigorous time and motion studies and identify workflow or human factors issues that may influence data quality or completeness in the EHR. And it's been used in a lot of contexts. Again, over 150 publications where the tool has been cited, spanning a spectrum from looking at cost-effective analyses to understanding sort of multitasking and switching in nursing workflow and the impact on sort of quality and safety of care, to looking at sort of the broader impact of digitization of electronic health records in clinical environments. Similarly, it's been used to look at outpatient settings, not just inpatient settings, and understanding sort of variability across any number of sort of ambulatory environments. It's been used to assess workflow factors in the EHR that may impact the reusability of data for disease-specific registries used for research. And it's been used to look at the workflow issues surrounding mobile health interventions as well, so mHealth in a broad scope. And these are just a few examples out of many that I could have picked. But my point is, in all of these cases, this tool, which allows for rigorous time and motion studies, is being used to improve workflow and human factors in the EHR and analogous systems in an effort to produce better data that can support not only clinical care, but also clinical and translational research. And so as a sort of proof of fact, I would argue that this is one of those many tools I alluded to before that allow us to overcome that first myth that human factors and workflow issues prevent us from being able to trust or extract sufficiently high quality fit for analysis data from the EHR. So that leads us to myth number 2. Let's say we can get that data captured and it sort of meets our needs. Perhaps we still believe that data privacy and confidentiality issues make it such that we still can't get to that data, right? So even though it's been captured, no one will let us get to it for research and innovation purposes because of a variety of legal, ethical, social, and other challenges. Well, again, I'm going to argue that there are many good methods in the informatics toolbox that allow us to overcome those concerns. And again, you see sort of a list of those potential methods here for different examples. But again, I'm going to drill down on one for the sake of timeliness, and that is data synthesis, which is an area that we're working on extensively here at Washington University. And we're doing that actually working in conjunction with a startup company based out of Beersheba, Israel, called MD Clone. And this is a platform that allows us to produce computationally derived synthetic data on demand from the contents of our EHR. Now, if that was a lot of words that you've never heard before, don't worry. I'm going to show you on the next slide what I mean when I talk about computationally derived data. But this is really a new paradigm for getting data that statistically and from a overall sort of data analytics standpoint is identical to the original data that exists in our electronic health record, but it does not have shared information with that data, so it cannot be used to re-identify the individuals from which we derive that synthetic data, which means it really sort of breaks the ties between the data being used for research and the source data derived from patients, and allows us to use data for research in a way that minimizes, if not potentially eliminates, the sort of risk of re-identification for the patients from whom it's been originally informed. And I'm going to drill down on one particular example to show you how this data works. So like I said, if you've never heard these words before, let me give you the abridged or cheat sheet version of how data synthesis works in a tool like MD Clone. So we find a cohort of patients, maybe it's based on a common diagnosis. We select a set of features for them. These would be sort of measures derived from the EHR and other analogous systems. And then we trigger the synthesis process. We get out that data, we do summary analyses, and we export and do sort of more in-depth analytical work. Behind the scenes, the way this works is if you imagine within that cohort and feature set, each one of those features can be sort of represented as a two-dimensional space with a density function, which explains where all the measures for the population of interest lie within the broader potential range of measures. And an individual patient then becomes a vector that passes through that multidimensional feature space. So what you're looking at here actually are two sort of lines. You see sort of individual measures that meet those density functions for a set of patients, and then they pass through this multidimensional space. When we produce synthetic data on demand, we basically fit a new set of vectors where the statistical difference between the individual measures in each one of those feature distributions is not significant. But there's minimal, if no, overlap between the vectors such that there's not mutual information. So we get a new set of vectors that look and feel like the patients in the original data set. They don't have mutual information, and they still adhere to covariance, sort of density, and other distributions in that broader feature space. So we've now simulated or derived a set of patients that are, for all intents and purposes, almost identical to the original patients. And therefore, if we run an analysis on that data, we'll get a comparable result to as if we'd run that analysis on the source data that we began with. So I'll give you an example. We did this looking at sepsis risk prediction, and in particular, a temporal reasoning task around sepsis risk prediction, which was, can we find those patients that are likely to become septic based on standard clinical criteria, basically the Sears criteria, and or suspicion of infection as evidenced by empiric use of antibiotics or the ordering of cultures? And can we find them 6 or more hours in advance based on their historical data, so we might intervene before they become critically ill and end up going to the ICU or requiring more intensive treatment? And I already talked about this sort of life cycle, but we went and got data for those patients. We went through the standard pre-processing and sort of cohort definition processes, feature engineering, and then we built a set of predictive models. And then we actually did a comparison and said, well, what if we did that same task again, but using synthetic data? And did we get anything sort of substantially different between the predictive models trained on that original clinical data versus the synthetic data? And so this is sort of the graphical view of the problem. Again, we're trying to solve for. You have time of sepsis is indicated by Sears criteria plus suspicion of infection. We move back 6 hours, and then we take all the data 24 hours or more before that. It looks super simple here. There's sort of 5 categories of features, but this is actually several hundred variables derived from the EHR. And this is raw data from the EHR. It's not been curated. It's not been cleaned. It's just the data that comes out of the EHR as is. And then we use pretty much off-the-shelf predictive methods, including logistic regression, SVMs with various kernels, and some other sort of clustering methods. And this is the important takeaway from that study. Our best performing model was a random forest model. And you see in the left-hand column sort of the performance of that model when it was trained on the real source data from the EHR without any synthesis and then tested on real data, compared to the right-hand column where it was trained on synthetic data that was actually derived from that source data and then tested on the clinical data. And what you would take away from that is actually this model performs relatively well, right? Its accuracy sort of in excess of 84% in finding those patients at least 6 hours before standard clinical criteria. But more importantly, there's almost no difference in the performance of the 2 models, whether I trained it on synthetic data versus training it on sort of the real source data when I went to translate that into the clinical environment. I actually have a paper that's just coming out right now that takes a deeper dive on this, but this is something that we're very proud of. We actually have a number of other studies, everything from geospatial reasoning to more traditional sort of statistical methods. But the takeaway is what we're finding is that we can produce synthetic data using these types of tools, and we can apply a variety of analytical methods, including cognitive computing and machine and deep learning methods, and we can get comparable results with this data as if we had trained those models using the real source data, but with the benefit of no longer risking the privacy and confidentiality of the patients from which it was derived. Now, we could go into a much deeper conversation about this, but I would share that we are now evaluating this at a national scale as part of the N3C initiative sponsored by the NIH, which is a large compendium of data used for COVID research. It's actually the largest synthetic data set that's ever been produced to the best of our knowledge, and we're actually now applying it in the cancer domain and a number of other areas. So we continue to sort of push the envelope of synthetic data generation, but I would argue that we have strong tools to overcome privacy and confidentiality concerns. So then, if we can get the data and we deal with workflow and human factors issues, and we also deal with privacy and ethical and social and legal issues, we might say, that's fine, Philip, but the vendors are still gonna make this hard if we have to work with vendor systems. And so therefore, it doesn't really matter if those other methods work. Well, again, I'm going to argue that we actually have very good methods for instrumenting the EHR today, whether that be sort of various APIs like FHIR, the use of common data models, data interchange standards, or combined approaches. And I'm going to show you an example of exactly what I mean. So we had a project that was first launched at Ohio State, and then we brought both the team and the project to Washington University, which focused on underserved patients in urban environments that were at risk for cardiovascular disease. And what we wanted to know was, could we deliver a point-of-care decision support tool that actually summarized a relatively simple risk profiling algorithm, in this case, the American Heart Association Simple 7 criteria for modifiable behavioral risk factors for cardiovascular disease, and use that to support or enable shared decision-making between providers and patients to address those modifiable behavioral risks and reduce overall cardiovascular disease incidence. And so this slide, I guess, proves nothing else other than that informaticians produce diagrams with boxes and lines. But more importantly, what it shows is that we took both historical data for these patients as well as just-in-time data from a given transaction, combined those together, applied our risk profiling algorithm, and then delivered that at the point of care. Now, this is sort of a faux EMR, mainly because our EHR vendor does not allow us to show screenshots of the EHR. That's actually not allowed in our contract, but bear with me. This is sort of a prototypical sort of screen in an EHR, and you see this panel on the right-hand side. Let me blow that up for you. So this is the tool that we called Sphere that's pulling that historical and real-time data and calculating modifiable behavioral risk factor criteria. You can see that each criteria has a color code and then a series of buttons or sliders, and then there's an overall visual analog scale and sort of an aggregate sort of indicator of cardiovascular health. This is important because now, once this displays in the EHR, the provider can talk to the patient and actually use the sliders and buttons to say, okay, if we get your hemoglobin A1C one down, or your blood pressure, or your weight, how does that change your cardiovascular risk score? So actually this allows for sort of the what if scenarios. So rather than the prototypical, like, if you just get more exercise and lose weight, which a doctor would normally say to someone, we could say, you should specifically lose this much weight, or maybe consider focusing on your BMI or your total cholesterol. You can kind of see which one of those decisions or behavioral risk factors might improve outcomes more than others. There's also a tool here that allows for the capture of patient-reported data that can enhance that algorithm. And this is actually my legal picture of the EHR that actually shows how the panel is displayed in real time alongside the user interface of the EHR. And this is actually using standard open access APIs to that EHR. Nothing special, just the out-of-the-box functionality that the EHR provides in order to interoperate and pull both that historical and real-time transactional information. And the result of a study using an intervention like this was actually, we showed in a practice randomized RCT that when we delivered this decision support to patients, we were actually able to see statistically significant changes in both body mass index and fasting glucose for those patients that received the digital health intervention as opposed that did not. This is actually in a step wedge design, so we actually controlled for the time or duration of exposure to the decision support alert as well. And why that's important is actually for two reasons. One is this was an effect that was actually pretty much comparable to as if we had given those patients a new medication, except the only intervention was organizing and delivering information in a superior format than the way it was organized before. Number two, I guess for more of a moment of levity, was that this study was actually funded by a pharmaceutical company through an unrestricted educational grant, and they assumed that when we did this study with this decision support alert, we would end up causing our providers to prescribe more cholesterol or blood pressure management medications. We actually ended up causing them to prescribe fewer medications because actually we were managing modifiable behavior risk, which was good for our patients, but not as good for our sponsors. So I guess the takeaway there is never underestimate the power of decision support. But more importantly, this is an intervention that was built using standard off-the-shelf interfaces to a major commercial EHR and allowed for this type of effect. So I believe that we can implement these types of digital health interventions today. And if you want to learn more about this, I highly recommend take a look at some of the papers our group has published. Here you can see a few screenshots, the overall sort of study, as well as some derivative studies focusing on geographic distribution of disease risk, et cetera. We've now extended this to cancer survivors who have received cardiotoxic chemotherapy, and we're seeing similar effects. That's a study that's ongoing right now at a national level. But the takeaway is, again, that is a decision support alert built using standard interfaces to the EHR today that enables shared decision-making and has an impact equivalent to as if we given those patients new medications for their disease. So perhaps that would make the argument that we can, in fact, implement digital health interventions, even with some of the constraints that vendors might impose. So that leads us to our last myth. Let's say we deal with usability issues, we get the data, we overcome sort of privacy and confidentiality issues, and maybe we're even building interventions in the EHR. Maybe you might say that's great, but IT organizations are too hard to work with. They're not interested in doing these types of innovation projects. They just want to deliver the EHR as it sort of exists out of the box. Well, again, I think that we have models from sort of progressive organizations that show us that that's not always the case. And they almost always involve some shared understanding and governance of these clinical information system platforms. And that means we have to do the hard work between the informatics investigators and the IT professionals, as well as our partners in computer science and healthcare administration and other areas, to define all of our roles and responsibilities, to sort of put in place the right shared leadership models, and really have a mechanism for scaling these interventions from the informatics lab into interventions at scale where it's appropriate. And if we do that, we can build these rapid learning systems, which are really the underpinning of the learning health system. So I'll just sort of share with you briefly a couple thoughts about that. That's sort of a much deeper topic, but I'll begin by saying we have to start by understanding that, computer scientists are not informaticians, informaticians are not IT professionals, and there are some sort of fuzzy boundaries between those disciplines, but fundamentally, we all need to work across this continuum where we can basically take these computational theories and methods, connect them with motivating problems, and then, if appropriate, sort of intervene at scale through sort of technology deployment best practices. And this is where that idea of understanding roles and responsibilities and respecting sort of these distinct fields of endeavor becomes very important. I think we've all been in rooms where perhaps informaticians or data scientists believe they could do the IT job, or vice versa, where perhaps computer scientists would say, informatics is just computer science and medicine. You guys, you should really just let us, do our thing. And I'm saying that a little bit tongue in cheek, but the takeaway is that in fact, these are distinct and complementary fields, and the real impact happens when we work across this continuum as a team science-based approach, rather than competing with one another for sort of space within this broader spectrum. And this is actually sort of a prototypical model that my colleague Chris Longhurst and I have been working on as part of a publication we've been putting together. Chris is the CIO at UC San Diego Healthcare, and sort of this idea of building sort of a shared vision of what a rapid learning health system looks like. And the takeaway is you kind of see a prototypical research process with rapid cycling between sort of basic and preclinical research and verification and validation of these sort of interventions, and then scaling and delivery in the real world, and optimizing and measuring sort of impact based upon whatever outcomes are of importance to us, and then rapidly feeding that sort of insight back to basic and preclinical research. And in each step in this cycle, you see both informatics competencies and IT and computational competencies. And so it's this idea, so this rapid iteration between sort of the operational IT world and the research informatics or data science world, depending on the label you want to use. And I think this is the model that we need to implement if we're going to sort of go after that use-inspired basic research paradigm that I alluded to earlier. So I guess the takeaway here is there are organizations that are excelling at doing this. It can be done, and it really is a function of shared governance and sort of shared understanding of roles and responsibilities. There's also an important caveat, which is not everyone involved in that shared model needs to be an informatician, data scientist, computer scientist, or IT professional, because there's another essential role, which is that of the data translator. Now, this is an article actually from 2018. It's not super new, but I really think it's very important when we talk about learning health systems, which is about what is the sort of role of the data translator in this broader ecosystem. And it's the person who understands the problem, understands the data that can be used to solve for that problem, and understands how to evaluate outcomes. And this is, for example, where our clinician and other sort of operational subject matter experts become absolutely essential to the types of projects that I'm talking about. And if we don't have these data translators, the likelihood that we're going to have a successful project that leads to sort of enhancement of that learning health system, I think is minimized. And so therefore, in equal measure to all those technical domains I talked about before, the data translator is an essential and really foundational role to building up the teams that can then exhibit the behaviors that make a learning health system. So just to sort of make sure we have time for some Q&A, because I know we want to make sure that there is sort of adequate sort of space for that discussion, I want to give you a few final thoughts based upon sort of what I've laid out so far. So first, I think it's really important to understand that the sort of evolution of computation in the healthcare sort of research and delivery domain has happened really, really fast. And therefore, we have a lot of open questions. Sometimes I think we get frustrated when we say, why don't we have better solutions to problems X, Y, and Z when it comes to the intersection of computation and healthcare research and delivery? But unlike almost any other sector, we've basically made this leap from paper to now talking about learning healthcare systems in just a few decades. That's a really short time frame. So I do think we have to give all of the sort of key stakeholders involved in these learning healthcare systems a bit of forbearance to navigate what is a very, very large research, innovation, and practice agenda. And it's a function of how little time we've really had to learn best practices for the use of computational methods in healthcare research and delivery. So I guess that's my pep talk. Keep in mind that we've not been doing this for very long. It may seem like a long time, but compared to other fields, that is certainly not the case. And I also think it's okay to be a little bit sort of awestruck by, sort of the computational capabilities that we have at our fingertips today. Now, this is a longer time scale than the last slide where I talked about a few decades. In this case, this is just going over a period of about 120 years, showing the evolution from when, in the 1900s, the first sort of mechanical computers, such as Babbage's analytical engine that was first used to demonstrate that Bayesian statistics were not just theoretically possible, but actually practicable, to today, where we have devices like the one you see in the lower right corner of the slide, which is a quantum computer that allows for us to compute in multiple dimensions simultaneously, leveraging sort of quantum entanglement theory. I've just used all the words that I have to sort of explain quantum computing, so don't ask me any tough questions about it. But it basically is an environment where through quantum sensing and computing, we can deal with previously computationally intractable problems because we can now reason beyond sort of a two-dimensional space. And that's pretty phenomenal, right? This has literally happened in 120 years. So it's okay to be a little bit awestruck and to be excited about the application of these computational methods, which is why that evolution I talked about before has become possible. Now, if we put all these pieces together, what are we steering towards? What does this behavior that I described before that is a learning health system look like? Well, I'm going to argue it's really predicated on sort of three big buckets of activity that I already talked about before. One is sort of the broad principles of sort of the behaviors required to create the learning health or healthcare system, right? We talked about this, instrumenting the environment, generating hypotheses, and importantly, also creating the culture of science and innovation where everyone's involved in this experimentation, optimization, and sort of application of new and emergent evidence. That's basically an environment in which we learn from every patient encounter and improve the care they receive, their family receives, or their community receives. That goes very closely with precision medicine, where through these rapid evidence generation cycles, we're actually able to integrate all this multi-scale data and treat patients not as a function of averages, but rather as individuals. So rather than thinking about how the average individual presents with the disease or an average individual responds to therapy, now we can leverage the best science aligned with the evidence around that individual patient to say this is the best either preventative, diagnostic, or therapeutic plan for you given your unique phenotype. And that's very closely aligned with that learning healthcare or health system. And then finally, while it's a bit of a buzzword sort of phrase, it is also a function of leveraging the power of big data, which is all about systems level thinking, and I think informatics and data science, which is all about identifying and solving these complex problems, perhaps using use-inspired basic research as a predicate for how we do so. And if we can rapidly translate between these sort of three major areas of endeavor, we have the potential to create these integrated and high-performing healthcare research and delivery systems that I think we not only want, but we need if we're going to improve the quality, safety, and outcomes of care, which currently are perhaps not as good as they should be, nor are they necessarily economically sustainable at a national or global level. And I'll leave you with this, which is one of my favorite quotes when I think about all of the sort of issues that I've raised in this presentation, which is that having a lot of people or a lot of resources or a lot of data is not enough if we're going to navigate the types of change that I just outlined for you. What's more important than scale or strength, if you use sort of the phrasing in this quote from Darwin, is actually responsiveness to change, because we are going through an incredible time of change when we talk about both building, operating, and optimizing these learning health or healthcare systems. And further, doing so in an environment where we leverage the EHR as that living laboratory to undertake this work. And so I think over the next decade or so, we're going to see a profound change in many of the organizations that are seeking to build and operate learning health systems. And that profound change will be those that are immensely successful because they are adaptable and are willing to rethink how they approach all aspects of teaching and learning, research, practice, and service, versus those that are sort of perhaps a bit more complacent and say, we are going to continue along the path we've been on for some time, which is largely that dichotomous sort of view of basic and applied science without sort of all the trappings of sort of the learning health system I talked about today. So again, I think this quote sort of summarizes nicely the challenge in front of all of us as we think about our roles as researchers and innovators and leaders, not only in academic health systems, but in sort of the broader health and life sciences sector. So with that, to sort of round out the formal part of this presentation, I just point out if you want to learn more about the work that's underway here at Washington University in St. Louis and with our partners at BJC Healthcare, take a look at our website for the Institute for Informatics, which you see the URL there, and you can see actually quite a few more instances of the research projects and teams that are undertaking many of the types of efforts that I described in this talk today. I'm also always happy to hear from everybody over email. You can take a look and you see there my email address. And then lastly, if you want to see what I'm reading or thinking about sort of this intersection of leadership and digital healthcare and informatics and data science, take a look on Twitter. I promise almost no politics and only the occasional passing college sports reference, which will only matter to people based in North America. I did spend 10 years at a Big Ten university before I moved to Washington University 5 years ago, so I think I'm legally obligated to make the occasional college sports reference. And with that, I'll sort of pop out of the presentation mode, and I'm happy to answer any questions, which I think Daniel is going to help to moderate.
Yes, thank you so much, Philip. That was a amazing presentation. So many very, very important key concepts that a lot of people have been thinking throughout the history of health informatics as a research discipline. So thank you for that. I would like to open up the discussion. We have some time now, and you can please feel free to pop your questions in the chat. If you want to make your questions up in the air, you can raise your hand using the Zoom functionality, or I'll ask them for you. So we have I think the first question is from Kathleen Gray. It's about the data translator role. What are your observations about where or when or how in the healthcare organization this role manages to achieve the shift from localized to scaled up and sustainable implementations or interventions?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So, first of all, I have this belief, which is not empiric, so just bear with me, that the best projects almost always involve sort of a partnership between three champions. There's usually a clinical or operational champion that understands a problem in the real world that they want to solve for. And that's really the data translators I talked about before. There's usually somebody with a strong sort of computational or technology background that can conceptualize how do we build a digital intervention to address that problem. And then there's usually an informatician or data scientist that has formal training that allows them to better understand how we evaluate and verify and validate the outcomes of that project. And there's a certain degree of magic that happens when you put a team like that together. I'll tell you, here at Washington University and with our partners at BJC, we actually have a program, which is a competitive pilot funding mechanism, which we call the Big Ideas program, and we run it once a year. And it actually catalyzes the formation of multidisciplinary teams where we ask for clinical champions from the health system to partner with informaticians and data scientists, as well as computational scientists from across the campus in our School of Engineering, and to propose operational problems as well as innovative solutions to them. We give them $50,000 in 6 months to build a prototype, and the expectation is that they sort of produce some set of scholarly products, maybe follow-on funding, but also a tool that can be deployed in the clinical environment. So a great example of that is we've actually built a solution using Amazon Alexa devices that allow people to go into a supply room and actually ask where the supplies are that they're looking for, rather than search aimlessly in this complex room. It's actually been quite successful. We've had projects looking at sort of a variety of sort of ways of improving online coaching for our patients through our patient health record portal, and I could keep on going on the list, but that's an example where we actually create sort of a process to help form those sort of tripartite teams I talked about, and also make sure that we can scale those solutions and use them across the system.
Thank you, Philip. And Wendy, you have your hand up.
Yes, hello, sorry I'm in transit, so thanks for the fabulous talk, Philip, and I wanted to bring George Breitberg's comment on the chat to everyone's attention about a fourth partner, which would be an engaged executive to really help make sure these things are implementable and aligned with the strategy. And I wanted to ask Philip, if you're a new hospital, not a new hospital, but you have a new EMR, and you want to go down this path of a learning health system, where do you start?
Yeah, so I'll tell you my first stop, Wendy, and I appreciate the question. We went through this when I arrived here at Washington University. We were about 18 months out from when I arrived to the installation of a single cloud-hosted EHR for use by all 15 of our hospitals and our 2 physician groups. Now, I would just say as a sidebar, I'd already done that at my prior institution at Ohio State. I don't know why anyone would sign up to go through 2 EHR go-lives. I guess it shows I'm a glutton for punishment, but nonetheless, I did that. But one of the things we did, learning from our experience at Ohio State and applying it here, was make sure that from day one, we planned for the needs of our researchers in terms of their profiles as users of the EHR, their access to data, and their ability to have dedicated content builders that could produce a lot of those sort of digital interventions I talked about if their experiments included those sorts of interventions at scale. And we did that by having a senior leader, our Chief Research Information Officer, empowered to oversee governance for the EHR as it was being deployed around those sorts of capabilities, by actually having a small number, a modest number of FTEs assigned for that purpose, and making sure that we really understood the roles, responsibility, and training needs of our researchers in equal measure to our care providers. And this all came down to sort of our executive leadership, back to the other comment you made, recognizing that research was one of our core missions, right, as an academically based health system, and therefore going live with the EHR could not just be about optimizing sort of standard of care activities, but also needed to optimize our ability to do research at the point of care or population levels. And it was actually one of the reasons why I came here, was because of that commitment. So I think getting that engaged executive, understanding the needs of your research users, which are different than your sort of point of care users, and making sure that you are training, supporting, and putting sort of the resources behind it, it's really a people problem more than anything else.
Thank you, Philip. And we do have a couple of CMIOs in our audience today, and Tim Fazio is one of them, and he asks the following question. What lessons can we learn from a recent external, and says, quote unquote, validation of EPIC sepsis model, assessing it as falling short, yet being implemented nonetheless, as we approach learning health systems and implementing EHR-based tools and predictions?
Yeah, so I'm gonna try to answer that question as apolitically as I can as an EPIC site. So the bottom line is that it's not just the EPIC module, and it's not just sepsis. Across the board, there are a variety of these sort of out-of-the-box predictive models that the major sort of health IT vendors are providing. And by and large, they don't perform well. And they don't perform well for a couple of reasons. I think first and foremost is an audience like this would understand that sort of generalizable models don't really travel well from one institution to another. So the idea that we're going to build a single model and it's going to work equally well on every single EPIC site, right, here in St. Louis versus New York versus, suburban, Detroit, is not really a rational goal, but that's how they're built. I think number two is that there's sort of an inability to recognize right now that these are not static, right? The minute I implement this model and I trigger alerts or I give report cards or whatever I do with the output, I'm actually changing this dynamic system. In a very different talk I could give you, I would talk about how healthcare is really an ultra large scale system, and therefore we need to plan for these interventions in a way that sort of accounts for that, which is sort of this dynamic nature that as soon as we intervene, we change the system. And these models are fixed in time and space that are implemented in most of the vendor systems. And then I think the third issue is, even when you have a model, you still fundamentally need to understand how to deliver the intervention. So let's pretend for a minute the model even did perform well, overcoming those first two issues. We have an equal problem that most of the EHRs engage in sort of clinical decision support overkill, where our providers are getting sort of hundreds of alerts, very few which are relevant to the particular context that they're working in. And that goes back to that UX issue I talked about before. So I think we have to get a lot more creative around how we think about user needs, and then how do we sort of overcome those UX challenges. And I would tell you right now, I tell my team today, we do not trigger sort of, in the EPIC parlance, best practice alerts as our primary vehicle of delivering sort of the output of predictive models. We consider that a mechanism of last resort because by and large they'll be ignored. So that's a bit of a long-winded answer, but I think the bottom line is these models are local. We've not overcome that. They don't transport well between populations and settings. They, don't always address sort of the dynamic nature of the system, and you still got to get that result back to people in an actionable format. And I think that's why we see these repeated failures as sort of these out-of-the-box models.
Thanks, Philip. Appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Philip. A couple of more questions in the final minutes. Paulina asks, do you think in the next 5 years, the learning health systems will rely more on A, native EHR functionality, or 2, interoperable API-based apps integrated with the EHR, such as the Sphere case you presented?
Yeah, so I was going to take the easy route out and say yes. So my answer is that I think that the role of the EHR is going to evolve from being the system to being more of an operating system for clinical data management and documentation. And that apps that are more point specific and address sort of the UX needs of various stakeholders, like the Sphere app, will become a more common way of interacting with the EHR. And I think in that way, we'll still have that common sort of, you'll excuse the technical phrasing, sort of service bus for managing all that data that exists in the clinical environment and sort of integrating and aggregating it on demand, while we can benefit from the flexibility that a lot of these technologies like these standard APIs and sort of apps that interoperate with the EHR will allow for. Because quite honestly, the systems that we use today are as though we gave a major corporation, you know, and I mean, no offense to Microsoft Word, we gave them Microsoft Word and said, you do everything in Microsoft Word, right? Whether you're, you know, creating spreadsheets, you're creating slides, you're writing documents, or you're writing code, just do it all in Microsoft Word. That's basically where we're at in terms of sort of the functionality of the EHR, and it's why we need that customization.
Thank you. Graham Hart, he's a CMIO at the Austin. He asks, does your EMR have a research module to help researchers identify patient cohorts and phenotypes and provide research logistics support, and whether has this been cost effective?
Yeah, so so Graham, it's a great question. It's kind of a complex answer. So yes, we do have research functionality that's intrinsic to the EHR, including things like what we call the research master file, which is a record of all the patients that are currently enrolled on study protocols, what protocols they're enrolled in, and who sort of the key contacts are. So that's really how we manage sort of consent and mapping to the research teams. We also have billing modules. I know that's sort of not glamorous, but they actually help us to translate the study protocol into sort of the financials. We have, distinct from the EHR, a clinical trials management system that does more in-depth operational management of the clinical trials. It's a commercial system called Encore. And then finally, we have a partnership with a startup company called Deep6 AI that actually has a patient phenotyping and matching tool that allows us to identify patients for potential enrollment in studies. And I would tell you that sort of our return on investment has largely been indirect. It is measurable. So it's indirect in that we are more efficient. We're using less people and less time to get patients onto studies, and we're having less deviation from study protocols, such that the study budgets are being adhered to and we don't lose money. And then lastly, there's this halo effect, because at least for us in major areas like cancer, neurodegeneration, and otherwise, many of our patients come to us for standard of care activities because they want access to clinical trials, and our ability to get them on the study sort of creates, again, as I described before, that halo effect, which actually attracts more patients from the surrounding region. It's actually why we're the provider of choice in our MSA, even though that's uncommon for an academically based system. So happy to unpack that more if you wanted to contact me offline, and sort of I can walk you through a little bit more of that sort of architecture, because like I said, it is somewhat complex. But I would argue we do see demonstrable benefit from the intrinsic functionality of the EHR plus the additional modules that we have integrated with the EHR that have bidirectional sort of information flow.
Thanks very much.
Perfect. And Philip, in the last minute, I want us to reflect a little bit. You know, you focused part of your talk in this idea of user-inspired basic research. You know, in this, I think the COVID pandemic has been a clear example of, you know, this need of use-inspired basic research. We have advanced a lot, you know, our knowledge about this new disease that is, you know, less than 2 years old, and we know, you know, it took weeks to know the genome and so on. But in this pathway, you know, we have broken a lot of things, and we have made, you know, decisions that are not right, that we had to correct later on. How much are we willing to, you know, break things as we move along this learning health system process? Because again, the examples that you show about, you know, algorithms that are not trained to the local characteristics, that are not kept up to date, that are not retrained, or you know, conclusions that are based on unreliable data, you know, those things are going to keep happening. How much are we willing to risk to advance in this learning healthcare system idea?
Well, I think the phrase you use of risk is the key issue, right? Because it's actually risk-benefit analysis. And I think what happened during the pandemic is we sort of were willing to take on more risk for more substantive benefit when navigating sort of uncharted water, if you'll forgive the metaphor. I think what was interesting about that is, while we've often been very cautious about this idea of digital health interventions and needing to make sure the evidence base is, really, really sort of, very robust before we ever sort of apply these sort of interventions at scale, I think we've actually learned that if the methods are sound and we constantly evaluate, we can actually be more aggressive in putting these sort of interventions in place. I didn't talk about it today, but we put in place a predictive analytics module that was dynamic, that helped to redirect patients with COVID from our emergency rooms that would benefit from palliative care because their likelihood of survival was so low. And actually we were highly successful at that, and actually saw a demonstrable benefit in terms of quality of life at the end of life for many of those patients. And it disimpacted our ICUs at the same time. I don't think we would have ever deployed that in another setting, in another time, without years and years of research. It actually worked better than imagined, and we continue to evaluate in other sort of spaces. But I just will tell you that I think that is the question, right? What's the risk-benefit analysis? How can we be sort of diligent in sort of monitoring potential risks? But I think my argument is that we can lean in a bit more than we have in the past, and we demonstrate that in the last 18 to 24 months.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And with that final reflection, I would like to again thank Philip for being with us here today. Everyone for participating here with your presence and your questions. And Philip was kind to share his contact information. So if you want to stay in touch, please send your questions to him. Contact him on Twitter. He's very active, and we invite you to keep our seminar series in your calendar so you can enjoy talks of this caliber in the future. Thank you everyone for being with us today, and thank you, Philip, again.
Great, thank you.